Well, we get to continue to hear from Lindsay Brown. And this afternoon we have a little less than an hour or so, but we're going to ask him to present for the first half hour some of the fruits of the Reformation, and especially the concept of Calvin and his missionary vision, how the reformers actually were involved in missions and how it impacted the world. But after half an hour sharing, we'll open up time for question and answer. So while he's sharing, I just recommend for you to start thinking what kind of questions, because we do want to have a time for dialogue for Q&A. And so we'll turn over the time to Lindsay Brown. Let's give him a hand.
Thank you, David. Well, earlier this year I was asked to give a lecture on the fruit of the Reformation at something called the European Leadership Forum. And it was recorded. It's available on YouTube, I think, so you can pick it up free of charge. I'm just going to give you the summary of that lecture now, which was an hour long, and I can't possibly cover it all, and just then focus on the cross-cultural missionary dimension. But of course, as you know, it's only in a few weeks' time. October 31st, we'll be celebrating or remembering the 500th anniversary of the time when Luther pinned his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. And I just tried to highlight three dimensions to the Reformation, because as I mentioned earlier, the Reformation shaped what is modern Europe, and actually it shaped North America. And a lot of people who are hostile to the gospel don't realize how so many of our healthy institutions have their roots in the biblical values which were espoused at the Reformation. Because what Luther and Calvin tried to do, and those around them, was apply the whole of Scripture to the whole of life. Now, of course, we all know that the first thing was that they recovered the essence of the gospel. They didn't see themselves as innovators, they saw themselves as renovators. So he was rediscovering what had been lost in the previous 1,000 years. Some of these things appeared periodically, but they'd largely been lost in the church. So Luther himself wrote, we teach no new thing, but we repeat and establish old things which the apostles and all godly teachers have taught before us. Of course, many people in the historic churches these days, particularly Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Church, have tended to view the word evangelical. I know it's somewhat despised or misunderstood in North America because of its linkage with political groups. But the word was used in the 16th century. The interesting thing is the word evangelical was used to describe those who had aspired to manifest authentic biblical Christianity in the 2nd century. It was definitely used in the debates with Marcion, one of the early heretics, in 180 AD. And the importance of that is it predates the birth of the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Church. So the term evangelical was used in the 2nd century to describe those whose, and I use this term with carefulness, those whose aspiration was to live under the authority of Scripture. So there wasn't an arrogance in it, but there was an aspiration, humbly, to live under the authority of Scripture. So it was Tyndale who said, it's a Greek word meaning good and merry, glad tidings, which makes a man's heart glad and makes him sing, dance, and leap for joy. And there you see three of the key theological foundations. You'll all know them. Justification by grace through faith, Scripture as opposed to tradition as our final authority, and the priesthood of all believers. But beyond that, it had a huge impact on music, which Dermot McCulloch, a professor of church history in Oxford, has called the secret weapon of the Reformation. Before the Reformation, you only had male choirs or male soloists. And it was Luther, who was very committed to engaging males and females in singing together in choirs. The first person to do it. Women were excluded prior to Luther. He wrote the first Protestant songbook with one of his friends. He was baptized in the same church that Bach was baptized in 200 years later, in the same town, incidentally. And this is what he wrote about music. Next to the Word of God, music deserves the highest praise. It's like a square dance in heaven. So it transformed worship in the churches. The riches of music are so excellent and so precious that words fail me whenever I attempt to discuss and describe them. In summer, next to the Word of God, the noble art of music is the greatest treasure in the world. And he wrote a poem called Das Musica, sort of honoring music. Calvin only allowed the singing of psalms. Zwingli wasn't keen on music at all in Switzerland because he felt it was a distraction, but Luther saw it as being central. So that's the first thing, recovering of the essence of the gospel. The second is, I touched on this morning, reforming the world. What both of them did was they basically smashed the sacred-secular divide where you had, they rediscovered the priesthood of all believers so that the ordinary person in the pew, as it were, was as important as the priest. And there's that quotation I used from Kuyper this morning, who incidentally was not only the founder of the Free University of Amsterdam, but also a theologian and Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who wrote this fantastic statement: in the total expanse of human life, there's not a single square centimeter of which Christ, who alone is sovereign, does not declare that's mine. And I touched on this three approaches to the world this morning: separation, assimilation, and engagement. Let me just highlight a few areas where the reformers argued for shaping key areas of life. Economics. Max Weber's thesis is essentially that Protestant theologians created what was called the Protestant work ethic. Some historians disagree with that, but it led to, in a sense, the birth of modern-day capitalism. Luther and Calvin had contrasting views on money lending, which was forbidden by the Catholic Church before this time. Luther was fearful of money lending and stood against it in the tradition of the Catholic Church, but Calvin took a different line, and he allowed for 10% interest for people who loaned money, arguing that Old Testament or Jewish laws related to usury or money lending were descriptive, not prescriptive, for believers in all times and places. And some historians argue that therefore he contributed to the birth of the Swiss banking system, which came out soon after the Reformation. And this is what Calvin said: we ought not to judge usury according to a few passages of Scripture, but in accordance with the principle of equity, which is what he was after. So that's very interesting. I mean, you may want to read, for those of you who are economists or interested in economy, one of my tutors in Oxford was Professor Donald Hay, a lovely Christian professor, and he's written 2 books. They're quite short, about 40 pages. One is a Christian critique of communism, one is a Christian critique of capitalism. And he goes right down the middle. He argues there are biblical principles in both. So he argues it's possible for somebody to come from the left of the political spectrum or the right, because there's an emphasis on full employment, an emphasis on caring for the poor, which often you find in left of center, but also in the Scriptures there's an emphasis on private property, for example, and the state regulating sort of capital punishment or whatever. So he doesn't take sides. It's a very balanced treatment, brilliant treatment actually, which you would expect from a good academic. It's nuanced. And that's what you find from some of the best thinkers who are academics. They nuance their arguments and they put some riders in. So Donald Hay has just retired as Professor of Economics in Jesus College, Oxford. If you want to get hold of his books. Work and Vocation, I touched on this morning. It issued from the priesthood of all believers and the abolition of the difference between priests and laity. So Luther wrote, what seems to be secular works are actually praise to God and represent an obedience which is all pleasing to him. So the postman is as important as the priest. That's coming down to brass tacks, that's what it means. And Tyndale, who translated the Bible into English, wrote just a few years after Luther, in the 1530s, while washing dishes and preaching the word of God represent different activities, as touching pleasing God, there's no essential difference. So it's quite radical. Now, Martin Luther King, influenced by this, I got a beautiful quotation, if I can find it, on the workplace from Martin Luther King. Influenced by Calvin and Luther, he wrote this: when he flew from Atlanta to Jamaica, one of my friends there was at a meeting, He's in his mid-60s now. He heard Martin Luther King speak in the open air when he got off the plane. He said this, "No work is insignificant. If it falls to you to be a road sweeper, sweep the streets like Michelangelo painted a picture. Sweep the streets like Beethoven composed music. Sweep the streets like Shakespeare wrote poetry. Do it so well that the people around you have cause to pause and say, that man does his work well to the honor of God." So what happened before was that you had separation of laity and priests, and the rediscovery of vocation as a gift from God, where Christians are engaged, developing really a theology of the workplace, has its roots in Calvin and Luther's writings. Another area is education. Luther wrote this, "If Christianity is to be saved, there must be more schools." And he did two things. Before Luther, girls weren't educated in German schools. He insisted 50-50. It's very interesting, within 40 years of his death, under the Catholic system before, there were 10 universities in Germany. There were 60 within 40 years of Luther. Luther pinning the theses to the door. And then you contrast Saxony, where he was, and Venice in northern Italy, Catholic context. The schools in Venice, 50 years after Luther, no girls. Schools in Saxony, 50% girls, 50% boys. You could argue that Luther was the person who really argued for the equality of young girls in the world of education along with boys. The impact of the German Bible. This is staggering. Luther translated the New Testament faster than anybody in history, 11 weeks, from Matthew to Revelation. Because he was locked up in Wartburg Castle. He didn't want to be there. He had nothing else to do. So he translated the Bible into German. And he became the most popular writer in Germany by 1530. And he's the most prolific writer in the history of the church. For the few years that he was in Wartburg, he wrote, on average, a book of 200 pages every 2 weeks at the height of the Reformation. They didn't necessarily form books, but he was a phenomenal writer. And I mentioned the impact of schools in Germany, and you could say, through the missionary agencies later on, and women's emancipation, they all had their roots really in Luther. He did say some sexist things, which I won't quote. So he was a man of his times. And we have to acknowledge that, with great figures in history, that if the world exists for another 100 years and people look back at some of the things I've said, or Dennis has said as principal or president, they'll think, how strange. Because each of us are creatures of our own time, and we, to some extent, we manifest some of the trends in our own culture. So we need to be slightly gentle and generous in judging people of other generations. But it is the case that he absolutely adored his wife. Katie was converted along with a number of other nuns, and the reformers decided to marry them because they would have been destitute. And she was the only one left. So he married her, and he told her, I don't love you, but perhaps I'll learn too. But when she died, he was absolutely desolate. He absolutely loved her. She was a fantastic wife to him. Well, I must give you a quick aside here. Luther was prone to depression. When he was in Wartburg Castle, he got depressed because, he was gregarious. He came downstairs from bed one day, and his wife was dressed in black. He said, "Why are you dressed in black?" She said, "God is dead." He said, "What do you mean God is dead?" She said, "Well, the way you've been behaving the last 5 days, he must be." Shook him out of his depression. a good wife. Reforming the World, Birth of Liberal Democracy. Now, I don't have time to go into this, but this is a blindingly brilliant article by Robert Woodbury, in the American Political Science Review. I've got a summary of it here in front of me. I'm sorry I don't have time to go through it. It's the best article I've read in 10 years. And his article is pretty watertight, that it's published in Singapore. Sorry, let me just get that. Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy. Try and get hold of that if you can, for those who are interested, because he argues that liberal democracy, with an emphasis, for example, on emancipation of slaves, widespread education, social care, and so on, all had its roots In some of what were viewed as some of the more radical groups like Quakers, Baptists, and so on. And it's interesting, liberal writers later on mocked them, but they won the arguments and shaped some of the freedoms that we have in our culture today. Religious toleration, Europe had been devastated by wars of religion. The interesting thing, Oliver Cromwell in England, again, he's a man of his own generation, okay? He had the head of the king cut off. But he made provision for freedom of worship in England in the 1550s as Lord Protector. And Simon Sharma, who teaches in New York, I saw him doing a TV program on the history of England. He was standing in a church in Putney in London. He said, I don't like Cromwell, but one thing I'm grateful for, my predecessors were allowed freedom of worship in England because of what Cromwell did here in this church, argued for religious toleration. It wasn't there before. He allowed Jews freedom of worship, even allowed Anglicans to worship freely. And he even said, I'd be happy for Muslims to come here if they want to. So that's why his statue is outside the Houses of Parliament in London, actually. I love Cromwell. He had to feed the clay like all of us, but he brought some great things in. Shaped, though, by particularly Calvin's thinking. Reforming the world art, I touched on this morning. Historically, we've always had an uneasy relationship, Protestants have, particularly with visual art. Here's a quote from a Welsh poet, oh dear, R.S. Thomas. Protestantism is the castrator of the arts. But let me make a distinction here. For Luther and Calvin, images of God were to be excluded, but not painting and sculpture, which were a gift from God. And some of their followers went too far in destroying all the statues. What they were against was based on the making of graven images in the Decalogue, 10 Commandments, making images, visual imagery of God the Father, Son, or Spirit. But they stopped there. So look at this quote from Luther. I am not of the opinion that through the gospel and all arts should be banished and driven away, as some zealots want to make us believe. That's some of the extremists in the Reformation. But I wish to see them all, especially music, in the service of him who gave and created them. And then Calvin, the invention of the arts is a gift of God, by no means to be despised. Now, you never hear those quotes normally. And you had a number of, the Dutch artists all had their roots really in particularly Calvinism. The difference is that before that, most art in Europe was painted by people from a Roman Catholic framework. It tended to be religious. What the Dutch did and what Calvin gave license for was he said God is the Lord over the whole of creation, so you can paint it all. So here you see they painted countryside landscapes, they painted flowers, they painted wine and food, they painted shells, because they were all from God's good, bountiful hand. And they worked from a Christian vision of life understood within a framework of belief in creation, fall, and redemption of humanity. There's a brilliant argument on this by John Walford, who until recently was professor of art history in Wheaton College. It's an article entitled, The Case for a Broken Beauty, The Beauty of God, Theology and the Arts, published in Wheaton in 2006. And let me give you another example of that. Here's one again. It's a painting by Rembrandt called The Prophetess Anna, but most people think it was his mother, and she's reading scripture. And what Luther does, and this is Johnny Walford's point, is that he paints his mother, warts and all. So what is brilliant about Rembrandt's paintings is when you get a close-up, you see all the wrinkles in his own mother's face. Nothing is hidden. It's not idealized. So you see the effects of the fall, but you have the light of God's word on her life. So you've got broken beauty. Or as Francis Schaeffer talked about human beings as, see if I can remember the term. Can anybody remember Schaeffer's term? That we are glorious ruins. So we reflect something of the glory of being made in God's image, but we're also ruined. And that's the best explanation of human beings as we see them. We don't say that human beings are entirely worthless. We say we are unworthy, but not worthless, because we're made in the image of God. That's a careful distinction, which some of our hymn writers don't always pick up. Some talk about being worthless, and that's not a biblical perspective. And the other thing about the Reformation painters, this is Cranach, who painted Luther, is that Samuel Escobar told me this from Peru. He said, when you look at the Roman Catholic painters before Luther and Calvin, very few paintings of the resurrection, a lot of the cross. The Reformation painters painted the resurrection much more. I took this picture over Easter in Aschaffenburg Museum in Germany, and it's painted by Cranach just a few years after the Reformation, the resurrected Christ with those to be risen up to heaven with him. Now that's important because sometimes evangelicals in their determination to speak about the cross miss out the resurrection. When you look at the New Testament sermons, the resurrection was in every single sermon in Acts. So there's a juxtaposition of cross and resurrection, which we need to recalibrate. Reforming the World of Science, brilliant book here by Religion and the Rise of Modern Science, by Richard Huyckes, a Dutch thinker, scientist, who argued that the shapers of the modern scientific method were actually working from a Christian framework. And then Kepler is a Moravian scientist, astronomer, who said when he was discovering laws by which the universe were put into place, I'm merely thinking God's thoughts after him. So that's a very brief summary, or by taking too long there. But what I wanted to try to show was that the Reformation was not just righting theological wrongs or inconsistencies, but actually was reforming the world and engaging with the world and showing how the whole of Scripture touches on the whole of life, which is wonderfully liberating. When a believer begins to see that God's word has something to say about every area of life, it's like a second conversion. Because sometimes some folks have grown up in churches where there's a very narrow focus on the need for forgiveness and preaching the cross and so on, which is central, but they're not helped to see the wonder of the gifts of a fatherly God in giving a framework for the enjoyment of the whole of life, which is what you get from the Reformers. Now, the third thing is recapturing a vision for evangelism and mission. Boy, I wish I had more time for this, but I'll be as quick as I can. Unfortunately, a quote from Ralph Winter. I'm not being critical, it's just he did write this on one occasion. Calvin didn't talk of mission outreach. And other continental European missiologists in Europe wrote the same thing. Calvin claimed the church had no responsibility to engage in mission. But notice the impact of Lutheranism beyond Germany and in the Nordic countries. Look at this one here. This is East Germany, okay, Wittenberg. I don't know how clear you can see that. Now, I studied European history, 16th, 17th century in Oxford, especially the Reformation. So I knew the names of most of the reformers. 1985, I went to East Germany when it was under the communist system to try and persuade the government to give us the freedom to have groups. And there was a 500th anniversary of Luther's birth. So I went to the church in Wittenberg, and under communist system, they'd put these stained glass windows in 1983 in the church in Wittenberg. What are they? There are 12 reformers. Notice where they come from, all across Europe. I didn't know half of them. I'd studied history in Oxford. I never heard of some of these guys who were from Finland. Michele Agricola. Who's heard of him? Any church historians here know about Agricola, the Lutheran reformer in Finland? Or Leonard Sturkel in Slovakia? Jan Laski in Poland? Jan Augusta in Bohemia? Gaspar de Coligny was influential in France. Johannes Huntner in Romania? Biro in Hungary. I haven't heard any of them. Cranmer I knew of in England. Knox, Scotland. Vermigli in Italy, and so on. But it was strange that under an East German government, they understood what was happening through Luther. Now, Luther was very much a German. He wasn't thinking of reaching the whole of Europe. But you cannot separate truth and mission. So when somebody's captivated by truth, they've got to propagate it. And it was the people around Luther. He didn't have a strong missionary vision himself beyond Germany, but they saw this must apply to other cultures. And that's what the stained glass windows in Germany, in Wittenberg, show, that the Reformation penetrated neighboring countries influenced by Luther. And here's one of them. Now, this is a preacher and a reformer in Slovenia. Most people never heard of him, but he created the Slovenian language in script. He translated the Bible into the Slovenian language. He's called the Father of Slovenia. And some friends of mine have just put a DVD together and a program for all the schools of Slovenia to show them that the person who founded the Slovenian state was an evangelical Christian of Lutheran persuasion. And here he is. that got his statue. But people have forgotten. But then recapturing a vision for evangelism, Calvin. Now, many historians have said Calvin wasn't interested in mission. The change came in 1978. I think it was Johannes Verkeil in Holland, who said, you have to understand that there wasn't much of a church to speak of when they broke from Rome. There was no structure. And so they had to spend some time trying to build in. There were very few churches. Calvin talked about dressed churches, some house groups, and then churches that had elders and deacons were dressed churches. But it took about 30 years to get to that point. And so until the early 1550s, there wasn't much emphasis on taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. What Verkeil also says is most of the world wasn't discovered. West coast of the States wasn't discovered by Europeans. The east coast of Africa, much of Australia, a number of parts of Asia weren't discovered. So the then known world for most people was mostly Europe. So when they might have talked of reaching the world, they would have thought primarily of reaching Europe. What is interesting is that Calvin, as soon as he could, sent missionaries to Brazil. They were killed, but he sent them there. You have to understand that in Latin America, he was dominated by the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal, so they wouldn't let Protestant ships through to propagate the gospel. They tried, but they were killed eventually. So there are all these mitigating factors. The change comes in the early 1550s, and for this, you've got to read the Council of the Minutes of Geneva, and I'll come to that in a moment. There are two things to remember about Calvin briefly. First of all, his theology of mission, and I'm going to read you some quotes from him. First is his vision of a victorious advance of Christ and his kingdom and glory. Some hyper-Calvinists would be shocked at this quotation. It's highlighted in the Institutes, where he writes, God the Father has appointed Christ to rule from sea to sea and to the ends of the earth. And again, in 1 Timothy 2, 5 and 6's commentary, our Lord Jesus came to extend his grace, not just to the few, but over all the world. That's a shocker for some people from that theological background. Or in Acts 2, he says the Holy Spirit descended in order that the gospel should reach all the ends and extremities of the earth. It's very interesting, and it's repeated time and time again in his commentaries. Deuteronomy 33, we must, as much as in us lie, endeavor to draw all men on earth to him. And 1 Timothy 2, the gospel must be proclaimed to all without exception. So he had this notion of the kingdom of God for all, victorious advance of the kingdom. Secondly was his all-consuming desire for God's glory, which I've not listed there, but it's in Deuteronomy 33, his commentary. He says, if we do not have this passion to declare God's glory, that all creatures do him homage, is it not a sign that his glory means little to us? That's the second theological basis. The third is his theology of the open door, highlighted in 2 Corinthians 2 and Colossians 4, where he writes, when the door is opened, so the servants of the Lord should make advances where an opportunity is extended. Let us not withhold compliance with so kind an invitation from God. And then his concern for the lost, where he says, God will have the people who follow the godly will not be satisfied with their own calling and personal salvation. They will have a desire to draw others with him. So that's something of Calvin's theological framework. I just completed a book on this, actually, to try to respond to this kind of issue. But the second dimension, and I must close with this, is Calvin's missionary practice. And what astonished me in reading these minutes from Geneva in the 1550s and some of his other writings is how creative he was. Let me give you 10 elements to his creativity. 5 you will know, 5 you may not know. Here they are. Number 1, he emphasized, obviously, preaching. Number 2, countless and many prayers for the lost. 3, the dissemination of the Word of God, hence the translation of the Genevan Bible. 4, he formed an academy in Geneva, which came into existence in 1555, only 9 years before he died. Interesting, for those involved in theological education, it was based on rigorous discipline where Greek and Latin were taught, targeted university-educated students, and the sons of the aristocracy. Almost no peasants studied in the Genevan Academy, which is very interesting. It's like targeting university students today. By 1564, when he died, 1,000 men were being trained through this academy, not only for ministry in Switzerland, but especially for France and further afield. So those are 4 of his approaches. Now let me give you the other 6. Christian literature. He was committed to the publication of high-quality Christian literature. By 1560, when the population in Geneva had grown to 20,000, in that year alone, he had started 34 printing presses in one town. And they published 300,000 books in that year alone, which were disseminated over Switzerland and France, and taken by Cole Porters into France. Kevin Adams is there. You remember the lectures from Bangor University where his prof said that the Cole Porters took sacks with Bibles at the bottom. They put jewelry on the top, pretending they were jewel merchants. If they were discovered, they could have been killed. But the routes that they took through the Alps into France were subsequently taken by the French resistance movement against the Nazis in the Second World War. That's a fascinating story in itself. Ask Kevin about it and his wonderful professor when he was a student 60 years ago in North Wales, or something like that. Anyway, number 6 was he engaged in public dialogue, something of a lost art. So he preached, but both Luther and Calvin engaged in dialogue with people, believing in the superiority of the Christian worldview. So there's one famous story. In 1536, when he was a youngster, his first visit to Geneva, Farel asked him, he challenged the Catholic priests in one of the cantons around Lausanne, the provinces, to a debate. And 174 priests came. And Farel invited Calvin along as a young whippersnapper to learn. He was about 27, I think. He said, just sit there and watch me at work. Anyway, he got into debate with a very learned Catholic leader, and the debate got on to discussion about the issue of transubstantiation, the presence of Christ in the wine and the bread. And the Catholic priest argued that the early church reformers and apologists believed in transubstantiation, and Farel was completely lost. He couldn't answer it. He didn't know what to say. He had no awareness of what the early church fathers taught. So he turned to this young Calvin and he said to him, do you know anything about this? At which point, Calvin quoted whole tracts by memory on what the early church fathers said about transubstantiation. He won the debate. Over 100 priests left the Catholic Church. One was converted on the spot, and the whole continent became a Protestant city, which it remains today. Seventhly, he believed in engaging with magistrates and princes. Now, this is important because he felt, there's no doubt Calvin sought to reach the aristocracy and the highborn. And actually, if you read the introduction to his institutes, it's an apologetic, I think he uses that word, to King Charles, the King of France, defending Protestantism. Because one of the things that had happened was called l'affaire des affiches, the affair of the posters. I think it was Farel who had put these posters up all over Paris attacking the Catholic Church. And Francis was very unhappy, and so he withdrew from his tentative support of the Protestants. And Calvin basically told Farel, this is a dumb thing to do. You don't attack people in public. So he wrote the institutes to defend Protestantism, moderate Protestantism, as authentic biblical Christianity. Then separately, John Knox, who spent 5 years with Calvin in Geneva in the 1550s, when he went back to Scotland, he wrote a booklet against the monstrous hordes of women, attacking Mary, who was the Queen of the Scots, and Elizabeth, Queen of England. And I shared that in one conference, and all the guys laughed. And then I said, Calvin rebuked him, told him you shouldn't do that. If you want to win magistrates or princes, you don't go attacking on a secondary line, especially if they're queens. It's a stupid thing to do. And he banned the book in Geneva. And subsequently, he dedicated one of his commentaries to the Queen of England. He dedicated the Institutes to the King of France. He dedicated the commentary of Isaiah to Sigismund, the King of Poland, who was a Catholic. And he dedicated most of his commentaries, you read them, to the kings and queens and princes of Europe, because he argued, you have to treat these people with honor and dignity if you want them to listen to what we have to say. You don't go attacking them in print. or in public. Now, many of the followers of Calvin have no idea that he was so gracious in this respect, because they freely will attack people in positions of authority. But his argument will be, and it's a lesson for us today, be very careful about what we say in public about those who are in positions of authority. Err on the side of the gracious, because he believed that that was the way to create toleration. And actually, out of the things that Farrell did, it led to the 30 years of religious warfare, and 4 million Christians were killed because of really the foolishness of fighting battles and attacking in public on things we don't need to. Essentially, he said, stick to the truth. You don't need to attack people by name. So that's the 7th. The 8th was his ministry, huge influence on migrants, many of whom came to Geneva. Geoffrey Elton, who was one of my teachers, who was a Cambridge historian, non-Christian, said this: Knox, this is his quote, after spending a few years with Calvin in Geneva, was refreshed by springs from the fountainhead and returned to preach the gospel in Scotland. And that's what happened to a lot of these migrants, and that's how the gospel spread across Europe, which has mega implications for how we relate to migrants and people moving into our culture from elsewhere today. The 9th thing was his commitment to church planting. The first church he helped was in Tournai in Belgium in the late 1540s. But if you read the Genevan Register of the Company of Pastors and Missionaries from 1555 to 62, there's an explosion of 140 sent out, 88 in 55, 140 sent out in 1560 alone. And they're going all over France. And let me give you this quotation from Calvin. I should probably bring things to a close then. He wrote this to Bullinger about all these missionaries going out from Geneva to France. It is unbelievable to see how impetuously our brothers are rushing forward. My door is besieged like that of a king. Vacant positions are fought over. Our resources are exhausted. We're reduced to sending men with a smattering of doctrine into these places. People were leaving their churches in Geneva and going to France overnight. Some lost their lives as a result. It was phenomenal. And it only stopped for 2 reasons. Because by 1570, within 6 years of Calvin's death, historians argued that there were 2 million Protestant evangelicals in France out of 20 million. It only stopped because the succession was poorly handled, which has lessons for us today. So the reformers after Calvin and after Luther fought amongst themselves. So for those of us in leadership, as best we can, arrange a healthy succession, because it fell apart, because there was no one to follow his example. Actually, the same almost with Luther. And secondly, you had the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris, 1572, which led to the massacring of over 100,000 Protestants and more in France, and the dispersion of the Protestants to other cultures. And that's why one church historian has written recently that what happened between 1555 and 64 was the story of the greatest home mission project since the Apostles. Now, more research needs to be done on that, but I've got about 10 articles by American historians, academic historians, arguing this case since the late 1990s when I started to gather the evidence. And the weight is significant, especially when you read the register of missionaries sent out from Geneva. It's quite remarkable. And Calvin's theology and the pattern of sending people out. And the reformers, apart from those in the windows that you saw there in that image, they went from Geneva to Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, Italy, Scotland, England, the Nordic countries, and took the gospel to those places. And that's why you have the stained glass windows in Wittenberg. So I think those missiologists who tend to play down Calvin's contribution, I think that my advice is to rethink the arguments, because I think when you look at the evidence of what happened, it's staggering. And I think it's up there together with the 3 periods that Ralph Winter talked about and the period in the last 25 years, which is the most staggering in history, in my view. I think this is a great period of advancement of the gospel, 1555 to 70, spurred on by Luther and Calvin. The man was greater than his detractors make out. That's it. Yeah, if you want a copy of at least the outline here, especially to get the books that I've referred to. Yeah.
This is a time for public dialogue.
Yeah. It's okay if you disagree, that's fine. You want to put another view? Sure.
First of all, thank you. It's lovely to hear that Welsh accent again. What you spoke about today resonated with my own experience as a chaplain in Oxford for many years. But one thing you didn't mention in terms of the decline of the church in Europe, and it may just have been a question of time, you didn't mention the impact of World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you maybe could expand a little on that.
Thank you. Good question. Well, it's always an excuse for historians to say it's not my period. But it was interesting that in Britain, it followed on after Kevin Adams at the back is an expert in this, the Welsh revival of 1904-05. Probably 100,000 people in Wales were converted. It was remarkable. But within 10, 15 years, the church was really struggling. And of course, in part, it was because of the question of where is God in the midst of suffering? And what it highlights to me is, I think somebody in the review I read of your book, you touch on the issue of apologetics. Some people don't like the word apologetics because they think we emphasize reason too much. So in Europe, the term we use is persuasive evangelism, which is an Acts, a New Testament phrase. Or I would talk about relational apologetics, where you start with somebody's felt question, you try to answer it. It seems to me the church failed lamentably in trying to provide an answer to the question of suffering and where is God in the midst of this and the reality of evil. Because often our simplistic answer was, don't ask questions, only believe. And the more thoughtful and reflective people, after a while, they can't live with that. And they become very angry. My whole family is from a Roman Catholic background, going back 800 years. And my mother-in-law lost her mother when she was 7. And so she was brought up by nuns in a school. And she asked the nuns, why did God take my mother? And they said, little girl's not supposed to ask questions like that. And she was angry with God all her life, till the last days of her life, because she thought that Christians weren't interested in providing answers to serious questions. So that's my point about trying to engage in both relational apologetics and showing that the biblical revelation is not just true, but it's relevant to every sphere of life. And it may be that's where we failed. In the Pietist tradition, there's a very strong emphasis on the uniqueness of Christ, but sometimes it's a bit weak in then answering the question, how then should we live in every area of life? And I think the best book in this respect is Colossians and Romans. Romans gives 11 chapters on justification, and then chapter 12 is about hospitality and how we should live and so on. So it's not doctrine separated from ethics. Colossians is the same, first 2 chapters about the supremacy of Christ, and then chapter 3, Francis Schaeffer says, it answers the question, how then should we live? In concentric circles, first of all, life of the church, the family, the workplace, wider society, and so on, working out from there. And maybe in American churches where often the teaching is more practical and applied, often you're ahead of Europeans, and sometimes churches are maybe weaker in teaching great doctrines. In a European context, especially in Wales where I come from, very strong doctrinally, weak in teaching ethics. So almost no teaching on sexuality, for example. Or many of the areas which touch on people's lives. So they need to know, how does this relate to how I live tomorrow if I'm touched by something emotionally or the senses are disturbed? I was speaking on this in a church the other day, a theology of the workplace, and afterwards, it was in a Calvinistic church. A guy came up to me. He said, thank you for this morning. He said, I'm a postman. He said, I've been a postman for 40 years and a member of this church for 40 years. He said, this morning, going out of this church really proud to be a Christian postman. I got dignity in my job. Before I just totally separated it. I thought I was second class. You know, I wasn't a leader in the church, a deacon or an elder or anything. But tomorrow I'm going into my work and I'm going to do it well. Because I see that's the vocation God gave me. We need to do more both of helping people to see how the whole of Scripture touches on every area of life. And it gives us basic principles or a framework. We have to work out the deep practical application then. But that's often been a glaring omission since after the Reformation was over. And we need to really face the big questions and answer them straight on, which really will require some hard work in terms of reflection and research, in really trying to answer people's deeper questions. But there may be other reasons for decline. Kevin, have you got any suggestions? Because that's your period of history. Why do you think the church declined? Apart from the liberal theology came in from Germany around about that time, and it just swept through the churches. So certainly, a lot of Welsh churches, you had people who stayed in the churches, but they were poorly taught for years.
I think I agree with what you said. I think fundamentalism took over, especially in Wales, and fundamentalism was only proclamatory. It didn't explain things. And as a result of that, once again, what you said earlier, I can't add to what you said earlier, in chapel, there was this division, and things changed in Wales round about the 1940s, really with Lloyd Jones bringing in a message for a secular man as well. And that really developed from there. So we had the neo-evangelicalism in Wales round about the same time as you had it here in America.
Thanks. I grew up I was converted in a Baptist church, the first believer in my family, as far as I can tell ever. I don't know if there were any believers before. But I went to this church. It was in a coal mining town. Nobody had been to university from there. I remember teaching with one of the deacons who was converted in 1904-05 in the revival, and I had a conversation with him in 1970. He was in his 80s. And I asked him, Mr. Jones, how do you read the Bible? He said, well, boy, I read it the way I've always read it. Since the day I was converted, I gets up in the morning, and I says to the Lord, I'm going to open the Bible, Lord, give me a verse for the day. And that's how he'd been reading the Bible for 55, 60 years. It was endearing, but it showed that he hadn't been helped to go deeper, which he had a lovely, infectious faith, typical of the Pietist tradition. But without losing that love for Christ and that devotion, he needed to add substance to it, and his faith could have been more enriched. And that's where we've been weak.
Thanks for all that you've shared today. It's been really challenging. Two thoughts, kind of a comment and then a question. The comment is, it seems like, to me, as I've studied missions a bit, that early on, a lot of the missions focused on evangelism, and now it appears a lot of missions are focused on service and good deeds and works like that. Now, in connecting that to my question, in Europe, is there a need for missionaries? Is there a need for missions? Or is it the local churches can go ahead and do, and we just need to pray for those people that are already there, speaking the language, living in the culture, etc.?
We need believers in every country of the world. And if someone is humble, who is biblically founded, who is have a servant spirit, who's gracious, loves people in the Lord, they can go to any country in the world. There's no exception, including Americans. So there's because sometimes people say we've had enough, but actually those kind of missionaries are in rare supply. And I often tell people who say anti-British or anti-American, would you turn somebody away if they had this kind of spirit? That's just the person we need, they say. And every country in the world doesn't have enough of those people, even where you have the largest churches. It's the servant spirit, a degree of humility, with biblical substance. I just in Romania last weekend, and it's one of the biggest evangelical churches in Europe, but I said, what kind of people do you need to help? They said, send us people who have had 5 to 10 years experience already, because some of us are starting out, we don't know what to do. Some of them said, we're full-time workers. If you're a full-time worker, how do you spend the day? Do you read the Bible all day long? Are there any people out there who've been doing this for a little while who can tell us? So we must be graciously critical of ourselves, but also affirming of the fact that there are needs in every country of the world for those who are humble, gracious, Christ-centered, biblically rooted, and concerned for building the church. So no exceptions there in my view. But it may be in some countries a certain type of missionary, maybe a trainer or a teacher, especially somebody who is has biblical substance, who can be involved in more of a mentoring and a teaching role more than evangelism. Evangelism is challenged cross-culturally because of getting the chance of getting under the skin of the culture is more difficult for those of us who come from outside. There still must be room for those and for pioneers. But I think a lot of where the American church is stronger, relative to many others, is you've got most of the best seminaries in the world. You know, the level of teaching here, I think, 60, 70 years ago, it used to be perhaps Britain, but the American seminaries overtaken the European ones. We're struggling with this tension between doctrine and praxis. We're not very strong. I think, on balance, the best American seminaries are stronger. They have some really highly qualified people, some great books coming out, too many to read. And instead of some of the best seminaries bringing some of the best folks from Europe and elsewhere to teach here, we would like you to send some of your best people to come and help us in other cultures. So, frankly, there's an open door. We need all the help we can get. Our backs are against the wall. Where people have that kind of spirit.
I'd like to ask you a question that's more kind of a sociological, cultural question having to do with the United States Church. And there's a tension between the individualistic gospel that has predominated American evangelicalism, especially among Anglos, versus the more multicultural Latino, African American and Asian churches, which are more communal and think in terms of people as a group instead of individual souls trying to get up to heaven. How would you recommend we move forward in terms of bridging that gap, which has existed for 400 plus years?
Well, I don't live here, and so I'm not an expert on this one. But I do think dialogue between the different groups is helpful. Doug Birdsall was here early this morning, and he's involved in Civilitas, where people from the different communities try to meet together to listen and try to understand one another better. And anything we can do to facilitate that is good. Of course, you're in a choice position in seminaries because you've got a degree of multiculturalism in the seminaries. Saw it even in the choir this morning. And people tend to be of a similar age. So there's more scope for actually asking, how can we inculcate a sense of communitarianism within the seminary so that when people are fed into the life of the local church, they take this as part of the package they have to offer in terms of trying to build and facilitate community orientation. I think we'll see more brokenness in our cultures with people struggling with unemployment like you've had in the Rust Belt. So they look for political solutions. And in a sense, that's an opening for the church, frankly. I'm not making any political comment here, but in a sense, it's an opportunity for the church to say, how can we build community? I mean, one of my friends is leading a church where they run a whole course just for people who struggle with finance and are in debt. And a lot of people come to that, and eventually they become believers because they say the only people helping us. Same with immigrants in Europe. What we're hearing now is that governments intervened first of all. People got tired of helping. And the groups that are stuck with people most is the church. So now they're reaping the benefits. In Germany, especially in Austria, one friend just told me a few months ago they just baptized 25 Afghans in his church. And I said, how many people in the church? He said, 120. I said, how can you baptize 25 Afghans then? And he said, well, nobody else was interested, so we took them all in, provided them with food and clothing and housing. And so it's up there it's for the church leadership to dialogue. Sometimes the congregation has better ideas than the leadership, and with people of different ethnicities, and ask, brothers, sisters, tell us what you're doing. What do you think we can learn from you? What are you best at? And then they will ask, well, what can we learn from you? But we need to create space probably for more dialogue and learning as brothers and sisters. As a principle, I don't know I can mention more than that.